Welcome to another session of the Belongg Book Club. I just want to say a couple of lines about Belongg for those of you who aren't familiar with what we do, and then I'm going to introduce Alana and the format of today's session. So Belongg is a social organization that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and community experiences to people who face prejudice and bias on the basis of their identity. So that could be gender, sexuality, race, which we're speaking about today, caste, ethnicity, religion, ability, the list goes on. And we do a couple of different things. We have an inclusive housing program, we have a mental health collective, we have a research collective, and finally we have the book club and library, and you are here for one of those sessions. So as part of the book club and library, what we've been trying to do ever since, the lockdown, is we're trying to host authors from across the world who write on these themes so that we can keep some of these conversations going, even as we are socially distanced. And now I just want to say a quick line about Alana, since she is, a very special guest for today. And again, thank you so much, Alana, for being with us.
Thanks.
Alana Lentin is the Associate Professor of Cultural and Social Analysis at the Western Sydney University in Australia. And we're very happy to have her with us. Her new book, Why Race Still Matters, just came out, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. But before I hand it over to Alana, I just want to say a little bit about the format of today's session. So the format of today's session is going to be pretty much like every other session we've done. But for those of you who aren't familiar, essentially, Alana is going to say a little bit about her book and read a couple of excerpts just to introduce you to some of the key ideas in her book. After which I'm going to ask her some questions to get the discussion going. And of course, you're all welcome to ask her your questions. So we're going to leave maybe the last 40 or so minutes for all of your questions. And you should feel free to send them in around then, or maybe even sooner, and I can integrate them into our conversation. So over to you, Alana. Thanks for being with us, and I look forward to today's talk.
Thanks so much for having me, Manjari. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am sitting here on Gadigal country. The Gadigal land is unceded sovereign territory of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to remind listeners that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, otherwise known as Sydney, Australia. So I have 3 excerpts that I'd like to read from the book. I guess it's probably best to start in order. So I'd start with the first one, which comes from the first chapter. Maybe I should just hold up. I don't know if you can see that there. Yeah, so this book is now out in the UK with Polity Books, Why Race Still Matters, and it's out in the US and in Australia in June, so very, very soon. And I presume you can order it online wherever you are, be it in India or wherever else, directly from Wiley, who are distributing the book. You can just Google it. And the book is divided into 4 chapters. And so maybe I should just say a couple of things before I start reading. I mean, basically the book comes out of work that I've been doing for a number of years, where I've been trying to think about what work that race does. So rather than thinking about race as being something that's connected to identity, I don't believe that race is identity. Race can construct identities, but it isn't identity, and it certainly isn't biology. It has a series of functions, which we can't understand in the absence of thinking about how it plays out in particular regimes, particularly colonialism, imperialism, slavery, and modern day immigration and border regimes, and ongoing coloniality across the globe. Yeah. So that's the way I think about race. I define race in the book as a technology for the management of human difference, whose ultimate aim is the maintenance of white supremacy. So that's kind of the very boiled down definition. And what I try to do in various ways in the book is I try to think about the way race is playing out in the current conjuncture. Right now, obviously, a lot has changed, and maybe part of the conversation people might like to talk about is what's happening in relation to race and the current pandemic that we're all going through. And it was funny because the book was about to come out, and I was thinking, oh, here we are in this crisis. How do I make this book relevant to what's going on today? Because things keep changing and race seems so relevant. But actually, the more I think about it, the more I hope, at least, that there's enough in the book that helps us to understand some of the things that we're being confronted with today, particularly, and this is what the first segment relates to, is what's happened in relation to coronavirus. So at the beginning the pandemic, or at least when the pandemic hit, you know, the global north, people who were interested in race and concerned by race were saying, you know, this is having a disproportionate effect on people of color, particularly poor and marginalized Black and brown people. And there was a kind of a backlash against that from within certain segments of the academic community who were saying, and I'm not talking about people on the extreme who would, you know, on the extreme right, who would oppose that for ideological reasons, but people within kind of liberal progressive academic circles who were saying, no, 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 this is about immunology, this is about viruses, this is not about, you know, race has got nothing to do with that. And part of what I try to do in the book is talk about how this notion that making it about race is anti-progressive, right, from a left-wing perspective, and people get very nervous about that. And my point in the book is trying to say that unless we talk openly about how race works in practice through a variety of contexts and systems and processes, etc., we just don't understand. We won't be able to eliminate its effects. Now, one of the things that I noticed, and many of us have now been noticing, is that there's kind of, you know, there's all these debates, which I think I said to somebody at some point, if you'd said to me 5 years ago that we'd be having these open debates about how many people we should let die for the benefit of the economy, I think even me, and I tend to be quite pessimistic, and somebody who's worked on race for 25 years, you know, I think even I would have balked at that, you know. But here we are having open conversations about the concept of herd immunity and needing to open, you know, everything in order to let the economy flourish, and so be it if a certain number of people die. I think somebody made the remark that as soon as Trump, I wish I could remember who said this, but as soon as Trump realized that it was mainly Black and brown people who were dying disproportionately of COVID-19, that he kind of lost interest in doing anything about the crisis whatsoever. So there's definitely a racialized dimension to it. And this connects to a kind of the rise of so-called race realism, which is not my coinage, but it's what they call themselves. So people who are kind of proposing a new type of return to racial determinism or racial pseudoscience, an open discussion of eugenics as something that has to be taken on board as a possibility, as something that we need to at least discuss. And this is made possible by a kind of a sort of just a rampant, what my colleague and friend Gavin Titley calls the debatability of race. In other words, that, you know, this is all open for debate, and I'm not racist if I just simply air the possibility that we need to talk about how race has an effect on IQ or, you know, on educational outcomes in employment, et cetera, et cetera. So what I do in the first chapter is I talk a little bit about the limitations, as I see it, of social constructionism as a way of trying to conceptualize racism. And I think what I'll do, if it's okay with you, I'll just read this little part, which tries to contextualize what I'm trying to do in the first chapter. So it kind of talks about the political moment out of which race realism emerges as a debating point, if you like. Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is on page 46 of the first chapter. It is also no accident that racial determinism appears to be gaining in public acceptability when the final nail in the coffin of multiculturalism has been well and truly hammered in. Race realists propose that so-called dangerous left-wing beliefs in human hybridity, which provided the ideological framework for mass migration into the imagined homogeneous cultural spaces of the West, are responsible for societal disarray. The division of the world's populations along traditional racial lines, each with its own natural corresponding geographical space, has thus been shattered. Put this way, the political implications of race realism become clear. While Western governments of all political stripes may not refer openly to the language of biological race, they all advocate for the control of migration along racial lines and enact discriminatory policies which reproduce race internally. They may not endorse the language of white genocide, but their practices suggest the tacit acceptance of what that implies. how else might we explain the passage by the Social Democratic Danish government of over 100 new laws regulating migration and the lives of migrants, asylum seekers, and their descendants, including a burqa ban and the designation of 29 areas as ghettos? Such policies conceive certain bodies as being out of place. We cannot then discuss them without thinking about how the body is the primary carrier of race and how bodies are collectively turned into populations to be regulated and confined. In other words, we cannot overlook the body as a racial frontier. Knowing that this is socially constructed does not overcome the effects of the ways in which race is lived in the body, both by those racialized as other than white and by those for whom maintaining racial boundaries around what they have amassed as individuals, as institutions, or as geopolitical entities is vital for survival. That's the end of the first reading.
Yeah. Great. So do you want to read all of the excerpts you have first, and then we can move on to questions, or how would you prefer to do it?
Oh, I don't mind. I mean, if anybody wants to ask me a question in relation to that, I'm happy to talk about it, or I'm happy to move on, whatever you suggest.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe as you keep reading and some of the ideas you mentioned become clearer, and of course I'll also help sort of explicate some of those with my questions, maybe then people will be in a better position to send in their questions, and we can start taking those questions, I mean, as early as in another, 20-ish minutes from now, 15, 20 minutes. So do feel free to, send us your questions really whenever.
Yeah, okay, sure. Okay, so the next reading is from the second chapter, and the second chapter is called Not Racism, TM. And this builds on work that I've been doing for a number of years, in which I try to theorize this concept of not racism. And I did it in a number of papers, and what I do in this chapter is I expand on that. And not racism goes beyond denial of racism. So we're used to the phrase, I'm not racist, but, or this immediate, rush to deny being called a racist. Sarah Ahmed has written about this, and many people have pointed out that, I think I quote in the book at some point, Aboriginal rapper Adam Briggs, who was talking about a situation where members of a football club in Australia dressed up in blackface for a Halloween party or some kind of party. And there was a furore about it on social media. And he made the remark that, it was talking about the racism was about the blackface situation was worse than being called a racist, let me get this right, for wearing blackface was worse than the racism itself. So he got into more trouble for pointing it out than what they got for actually doing that. And so we're all familiar with this kind of thing. And I also mention at the start of the chapter the euphemisation of racism. So this inability to actually use the word racism. And I quote there from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who talked about, maybe I'll read that out as well. It's just the opening quote that I use in the chapter. She says, at this point, I think it's a tweet by her, at this point, those who use the terms racially tinged or racially charged to describe white supremacy should be prepared to explain why they chose to employ those terms instead of racist or racism. If the answer is their own discomfort, they're protecting the wrong people. And I then go on to talk about the time when Donald Trump had called herself, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other women of color, congresswomen, he'd called them savages. And then he said, I'm not racist, I'm the least racist person. And various, Trump is one, and various other political figures who I described briefly in the opening to this chapter, who constantly describe themselves as having no racist bone in their body. And I'm really interested by this notion of the racist bone, yeah? But this is all foregrounding the way in which I describe not racism, which I say is it goes beyond the denial to actually redefining what racism is. And racism from the not racist perspective could only really be defined by the people who do not face racism. Because if you face racism, you're purportedly too emotional about it, you're unable to be objective, and you're unable to tell us what racism is. That needs the kind of the cool, standpoint of somebody who is not affected by racism, who will give what David Goodhart, who's another figure who I discuss in this chapter, calls the normal definition of racism. And the so-called normal definition of racism, according to Goodhart, but not only, I think this is what most people think, that racism is about is always intentional, is always hateful, is always vitriolic. And one philosopher of race who I discuss in another paper says it has to be vicious. It's always vicious. And I argue, and I think this is generally accepted in critical race critical thinking, that, you know, very often racism does not appear as vicious, does not appear as intentional, does not appear as hateful, but it manifests almost subtly in a variety of contexts. So this not racism is not only the denial of racism, it's also this redefinition from this purportedly white objectivity, and it ultimately enacts what I call a form of discursive racist violence, because this constantly being told that what you're experiencing is not what you're experiencing is a form of violence. And so in the excerpt that I want to read, I discuss this in relation to something that people may remember from the media kind of last year around the actor Liam Neeson, who recounted a story about how he had wanted to murder a black man, and how this was talked about in the media. So I'll read this now. Gavin Titley's discussion of how social media exchanges are typified by what Sanjay Sharma calls a racialized info overload illuminates the difficulty of enhancing racial literacy in public discourse. Examples from contemporary media abound, from the question posed by television documentaries with titles such as "Is Australia Racist?" to a social media explorations of the true intent of Irish actor Liam Neeson's admittance that he once wanted to find any black man to kill in revenge for the rape of a friend. Was race really at play? The responses to Neeson shed light on how the not racism I propose characterizes how we speak about racism today goes beyond denial and pseudo-humanistic declarations of colorblindness. Not racism entails the constant redefinition of racism to suit white agendas and goes to the heart of the question of who gets to define what racism is. We are long past the days of post-racialism theorized by Bonilla Silva and others. Today, defining racism has become a site of political struggle. Neeson's story is but one example, but for Gary Young, it had a sharpening effect. This is a reference to the Black British journalist Gary Young, and this is a quote from an article that he wrote after the Liam Neeson incident. The next time someone asks me why I have a chip on my shoulder, I need no longer brush the question away with disdain. I can say with all sincerity, because there may well be an Oscar-nominated actor out there who wants to kill me, so I have to be alert at all times. End of quote. The fact that Neeson asked his friend the color of her attacker's skin can only be understood against the centuries-old role that black male sexuality plays in the justification of racism in general and lynching in particular. That was another quote from Young. In contrast, others applauded Neeson for divulging a 40-year-old story that he could easily have kept hidden as an uncomfortable but useful exercise, eliding the fact that his publicists considered that a fantasy about murdering a black man was an acceptable narrative to draw on to promote the revenge film in which he stars, Cold Pursuit. One African-American conservative columnist, for example, felt Neeson uttered uncomfortable truths about himself and his own prejudice, as opposed to what she calls the extremely unhelpful PC script of white guilt. The dominant view expressed in the dismissal of Young's fears as unhelpful political correctness is that leaping to accusations of racism is needlessly denunciatory. However, this is only possible if racism is treated as just another opinion among a diversity of viewpoints, which avoids the uncomfortable truth that Neeson had unconsciously or otherwise absorbed the history of white supremacism and thus calculated that he would be able to kill and by deploying the legal cover of self-defense, get away with it. The adjudication of whether a statement, an action, or a process is racist in our mediated public culture eschews engagement with what race does as a discursive and performative regime in these scenarios. The discussion of whether someone like Neeson is racist happens in unconscious comparison to hegemonic accounts of what racism is and what a racist looks like. Neeson's admission is itself proffered as proof of his non-racism. I'm not racist, he told Good Morning America. I'm a fairly intelligent guy, and that's why it kind of shocked me when I came back to Earth. the quest for personification on both sides of the argument, those for whom Neeson has offered us a teachable moment about the universality of revenge, and those for whom he epitomizes the racism lurking behind urbane civility, bypasses a more nuanced analysis of the landscape in which these events play out. In this terrain, the question of who can control the definition of racism has grown in importance almost as a function of the lack of control that many racialized people have over the determination of their life course. So that's the second one.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think you have one more, right?
I do, yeah. So the third one is from the third chapter, which is called Making It About Race. And while the second chapter, so the second half of the second chapter, which after theorizing not racism and going into greater detail about the invention of the term racism and how it sits in relation to race, which, so that's a bit of a kind of a historical, theoretical discussion in the middle, I then pivot to talking about a group of scholars in the UK who've also been very instrumental in supporting the race realists. So people like the professor of politics at Birkbeck College, Eric Kaufman, who wrote a report called Racial Self-Interest is Not Racism. So I discussed those figures who are mainly on the right in the second chapter. And in the third chapter, I talk mainly about what I call the white left. And I discuss the problems that they have with talking openly about race and the discussion, as they would see it, of the limitations of identity politics. And my basic argument in the chapter, so if you want to boil it down, is that when I hear that identity politics are a distraction from the left or from anti-racism, and these two things are often conflated because I don't believe that the left is anti-racist in general. What I want to answer in response to that isn't constantly saying that identity politics are a distraction from anti-racism, not itself a distraction from anti-racism. In other words, what is the agenda here around making such a big deal about the extravagances or the excesses of certain forms of cultural politics and taking away from what they suggest is more important, which is the kind of, shared struggle against race and class. And I'm arguing that actually these types of arguments themselves are distractions, although they claim to be helpful by naming race as unhelpful. And all of this hinges to a large degree, in my opinion, on a sort of a failure to engage with the race literature seriously, a kind of a belief that we know what race is, that we don't really need to do the reading, and that which mischaracterizes the history and the sociology of race and how it sits with racism. And in the chapter, I discuss a book by the Pakistani-American writer Asad Haider. His book is called Mistaken Identity, and it came out with Verso in 2018. And I think this is quite an interesting book, which is why I wanted to take it seriously in the chapter. But I think it does suffer from a number of things. And the most important thing that it suffers from is a very partial reading of the race literature, which ultimately ends up with him being unable or unwilling perhaps to take race seriously, and ultimately kind of throw his hands up in frustration and talk about this, this kind of making it about race being a distraction from the common cause of the left. So yeah, so in this reading, it was difficult for me to pick out a part that, because you kind of, the way the argument is constructed, you kind of have to read the whole chapter in order to understand, because there's kind of like nitty-gritty stuff in there around theory, which I try to kind of connect it to issues in social movement politics and so on and so forth. It's my nerdy chapter in a way, yeah. So that's why I've been giving quite a lot of backdrop to it. But in this small passage, I really deal with how Haider, to my mind, misunderstands race. And hopefully that'll interest you and you'll want to read more of the chapter. Okay, Frustration with the limitations of identity politics is a key dimension of the question, what's the use of race? Or in the terms of this book, why does race matter? Haider, this is a reference to Assad Haider, sees race as a categorical distinction that is created by the ideology of racism. Race is thus of no use as, quote, a foundation for political analysis because it reproduces this ideology. This view of race as having been created out of ideological racism differs substantially from the one I have been presenting in this book, that race itself is a technology rather than a category that pre-exists the idea of a taxonomical system of biological races. Race from this perspective should be understood as a project and a process elaborated by regimes such as colonialism and slavery, and within which structures and ideologies take shape over time. Racial ideology for Haider reduces human culture to biology. This misses the extent to which the biological is only one register in which race is played, as I have been arguing throughout. To adequately critique the insufficiency of tightly bonded concepts of identity as a basis for political action, it is necessary to elaborate more profound accounts of how the instability of race means that it requires constant remaking. In other words, it is only by having a sophisticated account of how race works, which does not reduce it to the merely ideological, that we will be equipped to build the relational interpretations that can foster more productive alliances of solidarity. In what follows then, I examine Haider's problematization of what he sees as the excessive emphasis on victimhood and trauma in identity politics. This is portrayed as an obsession of contemporary social justice discourse. An examination of how it is treated in Mistaken Identity, and especially the connections Haider draws between movement politics and academic theory, leads me to ask whether the focus on these ultimately narrow debates may do more harm than good when it comes to the business of becoming more free, or, as the Italian Ivorian trade union activist Abu Bakar Sumahoro puts it, having the right to happiness. I ask what is lost when we fail to adequately explain how and why race matters in these discussions. I conclude the chapter by questioning the utility of a narrow US perspective on identity politics for anti-racism in other locations that are nevertheless forced to exist in the shadows of its racial legacies. That's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Alana. So now I'm going to just begin with my questions. And of course, if any of you who've joined us today have any questions, feel free to start sending them in, and I'm going to weave them into our discussion. I just wanted to begin by, and you know, you've spoken about this a little bit already, but I was wondering if we could discuss this at some more length, was by talking about your conception of race. You use the word technology for race, and you've said that, you know, race has a function. It does something. It is both socially constructed and socially constructs racialized subjects, right? If I understood you correctly. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this processual understanding. What are some of the racializing processes you may have had in mind while conceptualizing race in this way?
Yeah, that's really good and not a small question.
Yeah.
At all. I mean, I think the point that race theorists have been making about race all along is that we have operated in mainstream discourse and in education with one understanding of race, which boils it down to 19th century biological accounts. So the pseudoscience, right? The idea that we can measure people's brains and find out, you know, their intelligence and all this kind of stuff. The kind of thing that we think about when we think about segregation, Jim Crow, apartheid, the Holocaust, etc. And these, of course, are fundamental for understanding how race was enacted in particular circumstances, in some of the most egregious circumstances leading to genocide and so on. But they're only part of the picture. And race needs to be understood as an assemblage, as a sort of a grab bag that builds on a variety of whatever it can clutch onto, right? And the biological piece is really only the latest, if you like, a way in which race was conceptualized. It was first conceptualized in relation to geography, religion, and only then in relation to biology and genetics, with the discovery of sort of physical anthropology and racial science, etc. And the reason why, because 19th century racial science created taxonomies, okay, or like lockdown taxonomies that were already there. I mean, of course, people were building up these systems on the basis of geography, etc., under imperialism, colonialism, but kind of locks these down and creates these taxonomies. So it gives us, we kind of do this counterfactual work where we think, well, that's what race was thought about, you know, that's the way in which race was thought about. So almost as if it was theorized, right, on paper by these kinds of scientists and anthropologists and so on, and that they then went out and enacted a plan that was already kind of preconceived somewhere in a book, right? And actually that's not at all what happened. What happens is, of course, that you have the invasion of the Americans and the subsequent, you know, building of the European imperial project, and then you have the necessity to construct logics that justify theft of land, genocide, conquest, etc., right? Now, if you then, we could take this further back and, you know, and this is not something that I deal with extensively in the book, but of course, you know, Cedric Robinson's theorization of racial capitalism in Black Marxism, he takes this much further back to a kind of the intra-European situation in which there's already kind of racial logics that guide the internal demarcation of Europe along racial lines, which are then brought into the colonial and imperial context. So nobody's arguing, you know, that there's a kind of a moment, like this kind of big bang moment where suddenly everything is racial, right? And that's kind of exactly the point. Race as an idea is worked out within the context in which it becomes necessary as a tool for management, for governance, for the better you know, enactment of the European, the project of European domination over the majority of the globe. And that then has a whole variety of kind of more micro level impacts in various ways. And when we see it enacted today, it's often difficult for people who are less knowledgeable or less sympathetic to thinking about the centrality of race to modernity, because some of the ways in which race is enacted today seem so different to, or so separated from, these larger kind of historical moments. I mean, I've had arguments where people will say, well, that's colonial, that's not racial, right? This is about colonialism. For example, I had a discussion with somebody in relation to Palestine. No, this is about colonialism. This is not about racism. And my point is that you really cannot think about the colonial without thinking about the racial. You need to think about these two things in tandem. So I think thinking about race as a kind of a toolbox, so a set of technologies that can be enacted in various ways, because of course we see race enacted in, you know, in terms of the prison industrial complex, so incarceration in general, policing, but also health. So obviously that's the thing that's effect that we're all thinking about today. Education, employment, housing, you name it, it has a racial dimension, right? And what we need to do is think about this as this kind of a toolbox, all of which, we need all of those tools, or race needs all, we don't, but race needs all of these tools to work as a kind of ensemble for the maintenance of white supremacy. And the last piece of that, which is something that various people have written about, but I think Patrick Wolf, the late Patrick Wolf in particular, wrote about very well, is that this is ultimately an unstable concept. So race is patently ridiculous, right? I mean, obviously, right? In its various guises, in its geographical, in its scientific, and it's in its, you know, pseudo-religious guise, right? It's patently ridiculous. And therefore it needs constant packaging and repackaging, and it adapts itself in a very malleable way to the variety of contexts in which it is present. And so this constant making and remaking is in itself, those pressure points, right, are the points at which you can pick at and undo race. But it's very, its adaptability is kind of probably its main feature, and the reason for which it's still something that we're dealing with.
Right. Thanks. That's super helpful. And I think that's also helped with us receiving a bunch of questions now. But So I'm just gonna say something and then I'm gonna tie in one of the questions that we've received.
Okay.
I thought it would be useful for us to speak a little bit about what the title of your book harks to, right? Why race still matters. And that obviously, as you mentioned in your sort of talk, has to do with the fact that people on both the left and the right exhibit a tendency to label those who talk about race as still mattering as divisive identitarians, right?
Yeah.
It reminds me of this quote by Sara Ahmed, who says, to say there is a problem is to become the problem, right? That's what she says about the feminist killjoy. And that certainly seems to be what happens in the case of those who speak about race as still being very much relevant in the functionings of power. And the question that we've received is from Ryan. And they say, hi, Alana, brilliant reading. Is the dismissal of racism as not racism a method to try and control the discourse? What are your thoughts? Is it a strategy to rationalize colonization projects or racialized hierarchies? So this question, I think, is primarily about how do we understand both the dismissal, the dismissal of racism, which I think can both take the form of not racism, and sort of, you know, why are you making this about race, which is another form of that in and of itself. So do you want to answer that before we move on?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ryan. Yeah, I think that's really interesting because exactly what you said, there are the two things going on. On the one hand, making everything about race, right, and wanting to control the narrative about racism, right? And at the same time, constantly repeating that other people are making it about race, playing the race card, right? And that this is an illegitimate way of arguing, that actually you expose yourself as an unserious person and a closed off person if you make it about race. And I think this is very much about, you know, it is about controlling the definition in order to delegitimize the experiences of racialized people. Because I think ultimately all of this comes from a place, at least in the global north, of deep white crisis and realization of the crisis that whiteness faces. Whiteness, having, you know, spent the last 500 years trying to preserve its supremacy, which, as I said, has always been on extremely shaky grounds, I think is reaching a point at which it's always been untenable, but it's reaching a point where there's a self-realization of the degree to which it's untenable. And that realization, which is almost in the unconscious, now I'm not a psychoanalytic scholar, so I mean this in a kind of a more political sense, it needs to constantly claw back power. And the main way, or one of the ways in which this is happening, is through this turning of racism into this matter for debate, and something which needs, so there's this kind of very purposeful decision, if you like, to delegitimize the experiences of people who face racism, not only because, you know, this is silly and this is, you know, you're why don't you see things from a colorblind perspective? After all, we're all members of the one race and all these kinds of liberal things, right? But actually because if people who have the majority of power and privilege in the societies of the global north were really to confront themselves with the extent to which the power and privilege that they have is built on illegitimate terms. In other words, it's ill-gotten, right? It's only there because of the degree to which the West rampantly spread, you know, across the globe and took the spoils of genocide, land grab, etc., etc. If people were to be confronted with the extent of this illegitimacy, then their entire world would crumble. So there needs to be this process by which people actively ridicule the experiences of people who face racism as one piece of the backlash against the fact that white people do not live in homogeneous, white people in the West and the global North do not live in these kind of the white homogeneous societies of their imagination where they're alone and nobody else is there. And, you know, nothing shows this more than the current COVID-19 crisis. If you look at the UK, the extent to which the NHS is propped up by Black and brown nurses who only yesterday they were trying to deport to the Caribbean and so on.
Yeah. So we have a couple more questions related to the problem of not racism. So I thought now would be a good time to bring those in. So an anonymous attendee asks, "Hi Alana, you mentioned the concept of not racism. I was hoping you could speak to the idea of the so-called anti-white racism and whether the perpetuation of the myth of reverse racism makes dismantling whiteness that much harder." So what is the role of sort of this idea of reverse racism, right?
I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have all these people running around saying, oh, you're making this about race. Racism got nothing to do with it. Why are you always bleating on about racism? Why are you playing the race card? And on the other hand, they're saying, but there is a real racism, and that racism is anti-white. And this is something that, you know, I wrote about with Gavin Titley in the last book that I wrote, which is that jointly written book, The Crises of Multiculturalism. We tried to talk about the context out of which, and so this was written sort of 10 years ago, and that was the time at which there was this kind of backlash against multiculturalism, and very much this idea that white people were facing victimization, and the real racism was now, the shoe was now on the other foot, right? That's where those ideas, that was the context in which these ideas were coming up. And so it's very interesting and paradoxical that on the one hand, you have this denial of the significance of racism. At the same time, you have this turning on its head of racism as something which is now anti-white. And what I do in the book, in the second chapter, when I talk about not racism, is I basically build on work that's been done by Barnard Hesse, who's a Black British academic who now works at Northwestern University in the States. And he's written a number of very interesting papers about sort of the history of the concept of racism, in which he talks about the Eurocentricity of the concept. And I try to build on that and also use the work by a French historian called Caroline Reynaud-Paligot, in which she kind of, she documents the history of racism and anti-racism in the French context, going back to the late 1800s, where basically the concept, the term racism, was coined by a group of physical anthropologists who were working in anthropology at that time. And many of these people were involved in straight up racial science, right? So they were literally doing experimentation on, you know, you don't even want to know or you can imagine. And they became very concerned at the sort of turn of the 20th century with the consideration, or they began to basically say that you couldn't anymore talk viably about differentiation between European races. So in the kind of taxonomies of race that these people were involved in doing, there were also some subcategories within the Europeans. So, you know, obviously Slavs and Jews, et cetera, all were in separate categories. And these people were noticing how these ideas were being used politically with the rise of sort of fascist ideas. So think about the Dreyfus affair and at the early beginning of the 20th century, and then, you know, the gradual rise of fascism and Nazism. These people became very concerned by that. And they started to say, well, you know, we can't be doing this intra-European racism. And they coined the term racism in that context, right? So race gets attached to an ideological function, right? And what Reynaud-Paligot shows in her work is that many of these people who were decrying intra-European racism were still extremely comfortable with doing experimentation on colonized people in African countries, et cetera, And, you know, one of them she cites in the book, I can't remember the name, but it's in the book, was comfortably arguing that, you know, African-American people had 20% less the brain capacity than white people, et cetera, while at the same time being a founding member of a journal called Race and Racism, which was an anti-racist journal. So the point is that the way in which racism gets theorized is Eurocentric, right? So it's never supposed to apply to the majority of the world. And that's the kind of the piece that I take from Barnett-Hesse and I build on. But also it relies on a very narrow definition of what racism actually is, which, as I said before, relates to the so-called normal definition of racism, that it always has to be intentional, it always has to be vicious, it always has to be vitriolic, etc., etc. And therefore, racism becomes, in the popular imagination, and this is the way that we discuss it in general, to do with being a bad person, right? So you're an immoral person if you're racist, okay? It's not descriptive of a situation. And I think it was Abram X. Kendi who wrote this, or who said this in one point, like, we should just talk about racism as being a description of a situation. It's not a moral judgment, right? It's a descriptive term. But we don't understand that at all in our society. So if somebody calls somebody racist, it's absolutely objectionable. It's the worst thing that you can say about something. And as I said before, echoing Sarah Ahmed, it says more about, you know, the person talking about the racism than the actual racism itself. And because we operate with this notion that racism is basically, to be very blunt, about being mean to other people, then anybody can be racist, right? Hence, the entire history of race in relation to colonialism and power, and of course the birth of the nation state, etc. So all of those historical processes out of which race emerges as a technology of governance, that we don't know about. It's not taught, it's not discussed, and as I said before, because of what it implies for the maintenance of white supremacy, it's so damaging on an individual and societal level for white people, it's brushed under the carpet. And very conveniently, what emerges is racism as bullying, basically, bad behavior. And I was talking about this recently. I mean, if you think about, at least in Australian schools, the way in which racism is taught about to children in schools, it's taught about as bullying. It's don't be mean, right? But the children have no idea. They don't understand what this, they have no historical understanding. And these, you know, children after a certain age, they're able to understand these things. So my daughter understands it perfectly, right? Because we've never not talked to her about it. But most children, most white children, they think about it as bullying, and they don't think of themselves as a bully. They think of themselves as a nice person, right? Then they're unable to understand how a situation is racist. And I think that doesn't just apply to children, that applies across the board, and it's very conveniently mobilized as a discourse which allows the idea of reverse or anti-white racism to flourish, because anybody, of course, can be capable of mean behavior.
Yeah. Wow, that's really powerfully put. I hadn't thought of it like that before. Thanks. Another anonymous attendee asked, again, it's a question on not racism, quote unquote, not racism. Are you familiar with the work of D'Angelo's, their work on white fragility? If not, ignore this question. If so, does it fit within not racism arguments?
Yeah, look, Robin DiAngelo wrote a book called White Fragility, and I think it's been useful for exposing how white people enact racism, reenact racism, or reinscribe racism through this kind of the discomfort that they have with talking about race. And what she does is that she extrapolates from the book, and she does kind of training courses and sort of public talks in which she tries to talk about white people's complicity with white supremacy that kind of finds its way out through the expression of their discomfort. And I suppose the ultimate argument that she has is that white people have to stop doing this. They need to look at themselves, they need to talk amongst themselves, and they need to dismantle their own problems and not put those problems on Black people and other people of color. And I think insofar as it does that, it's very useful. But I think also that there's a problem with the concept of white fragility and with whiteness studies in general, because it cannot avoid, and I think Robin DiAngelo knows this herself, and I think she even says this openly, and I think you know, by talking about this openly, I think it's useful, but it still doesn't get over the problem that it ends up recentering whiteness in all of this. So it's kind of a problem when what you want to do is dismantle white supremacy, but you can only get there by making it all about whiteness. And I think that's intensely problematic, because that's not, at least it's not my interest, because my interest is in theorizing and deconstructing race as a concept and as I said before, a series of processes and practices. And I don't think, and while the ultimate aim of race is the maintenance of white supremacy, I'm not interested in white identities. Like, I really don't care, right, about white identities. And I think there's a problem when you recenter white identities and white feelings in conversations about race. Whiteness studies, critical whiteness studies have had their great place of importance, but of course the best whiteness studies is done by Black authors. I mean, thinking back to the first theorist of whiteness, well, that I can name is of course the African-American sociologist W.B. Du Bois, and more recently Cheryl Harris's work on whiteness as property is probably the most seminal text that we have in relation to US critical race readings from a legal perspective. More recently, Gloria Vecker's work on white innocence, and of course Charles Mills's work on white ignorance. And I think if we take the ensemble, if we were to take those four authors together, then I don't think we would, then, I mean, okay, I would also add the work of people like Noel Ignatieff on the Irish, people like David Roediger, who's very usefully theorized race and class via whiteness, which I think has been very important from a kind of a particular US history, also Marxist history perspective. So these are all really important texts. And I'm not sure whether the white fragility approach, which I perhaps slightly unkindly have characterized as kind of as a critical whiteness self-help literature, right? I'm not sure the extent to which this adds, maybe that's a bit unfair. It does good work, but I think it has its limitations. Let's put it that way.
Sure. Okay, great. Before we move on, I just want to say to our participants, if you sent in a question and I haven't sort of weaved it into the conversation yet, that's because it speaks really well to a slightly later part of the conversation, and I'm definitely sort of keeping tabs, so don't worry at all. I just wanted to, I thought this would be important to talk about. So in the introduction to your book, you talk about your experience of being Jewish, right? And I thought the complex position of Jews in this paradigm of race and racism would definitely be worth discussing, because on the one hand, they're perceived as white, but equally there exists this long history of violence and discrimination against Jews, where they were sort of the internal other in Europe, right? And of course, what it means to be Jewish is not the same across locations. So I guess what I took away from your discussion of that was the importance of location in understanding Jewish identity. And I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that and your own location in relation to that.
Yeah, this is really interesting. For me personally, I was somebody, I hadn't ever written very much about anti-Semitism, but I have been doing more so in recent times. And I didn't actually set out to include a chapter about anti-Semitism in this book. But as you'll be aware, over the last few years, the kind of the debates or the furore around anti-Semitism, particularly around the British Labour Party when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, but also I'm thinking about figures like Ilhan Omar in the United States, and other places. There's been this kind of very, very entrenched kind of argument about what anti-Semitism is and how we define it, in particular in relation to anti-Zionism and ongoing colonization of Palestine. And so I felt that this was something that had to be dealt with in the book. And so the fourth chapter, which I haven't read from, but which is called Good Jew, Bad Jew, tries to theorize what anti-Semitism is doing in the present moment. And my own location in relation to all of that is as somebody who was brought up in Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s, when I can tell you there were not many Jews. And so my relationship to being Jewish is quite different to somebody who perhaps grew up in a metropolitan center where there are many more Jewish people and a much more kind of established Jewish community. And for example, in areas of the United States where Jewish culture in many ways is hegemonic, right? Or is incredibly important in terms of the cultural landscape that wasn't my experience growing up at all. Now, I've had the great fortune in my life to be able to move around and live in various locations. Interestingly, as an aside, one of the places that I have lived in for about a year was Hungary in the early 90s. And when I think about what's happening in relation to Jews and also Roma people in Hungary under the current fascist dictatorship, which we can only call it that, then I absolutely shudder. And so, you know, the experience to belonging to a particular racialized minority is going to be different depending on where you are. But unlike people who are more visibly racialized, I am able to recede into the shadows unless I make it obvious that I'm talking from a Jewish location. And I do make it obvious, and I have been attacked for it most recently over the last couple of weeks, receiving a lot of extremely vitriolic attacks via social media and to my personal email and so on and so forth. But it's not the same. And one of the things that I do in the chapter is that I talk about the relationship between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I try to argue that today, at least, I don't think we can mount a credible theorization of anti-Semitism without relating it to Islamophobia. However, the reverse isn't true. So Islamophobia can be theorized independently of anti-Semitism. I'm not saying this is true historically. Anti-Semitism can be theorized historically independently, but today, in terms of how it's functioning today, because of the question of Zionism and the question of the constructed antagonism between Jews and Muslims, and constructed from the outside, right? It's not something that's internally constructed. It's something that's imposed on both of our communities. So we're dealt this, you know, this hand of you guys are at war, right? Means that we're in this relationship. Jews and Muslims and the question of anti-Semitism, the question of Islamophobia are in a relationship. But unlike most white Jews in European or North American, Australasian, etc. contexts, Muslim people face institutional racism in a way that Jews do not face. So we're not disproportionately incarcerated. We do not face discrimination in employment, education, etc., in the same way that many, many Muslim people do, particularly since the onslaught of the so-called war on terror. So I think that's important to state. Having said that, I think the function of anti-Semitism today is really problematic politically, because you have this alliance between people who are nominally struggling against racism, or at least on paper are struggling against racism, but only struggling against racism of a particular form, which is anti-Semitism. And this struggle against anti-Semitism, and it's not a real struggle, right? It's, you know, the sort of performance of a struggle against anti-Semitism, stands as a proxy for anti-racism in general. So being against anti-Semitism allows all kinds of characters, some of whom are extremely politically problematic, and that's a euphemism, allows them to shield themselves from accusation of racism because they are supposedly on the side of Jews. And this extends to extremely problematic alliances between, for example, the aforementioned dictator of Hungary, Viktor Orban, and various creatures from, you know, from Israel and from within the Jewish community in Britain and other places. So there's a really unholy alliance that's being constructed between white supremacist fascists, Zionists, and others purportedly in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. And what that does is create a situation whereby if you are a Jewish person who opposes hegemonic accounts of what anti-Semitism is because you don't agree that that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you then end up in a situation, or I end up in a situation of being called anti-Semitic by people who are not Jews, who are not anti-racist, and who are in bed with some people who would, you know, let's call a spade, would gladly have me killed, right, in another context. So fascists, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, etc. So that's a situation that we're in. And I find it extremely, extremely dangerous And in the current moment, I mean, of course, you've always had Jews being named as responsible for mass migration and white genocide. And so it's like the so-called, those who orchestrate it from the behind the scenes, the Illuminati and the globalists and all of these kind of code words that are constantly dropped in. But in the context of the coronavirus, of course, not only are the Chinese responsible for the invention of some kind of whatever, but it's of course the Jews who are financing that. So there's a whole new kind of mobilization of anti-Semitic memes around the current crisis.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's move on. Let's actually take it from where you left it. So before I carry on, I just want to say we're not going to be able to take new questions because I think we have just about enough time to run through the remaining ones. But thank you all to everyone who shared them so far, and we're definitely going to take those. So this question is from, so first let me just say, I mean, we've already alluded to it a little bit, which is the role of racism, or how racism reveals itself in the management of the current crisis, right? And I think that's something important for us to talk about. And the question that we have here from Bolaji, I'm sorry if I've completely butchered your name. How is race related to the COVID-19 pandemic? Is there a genuine correlation between Blackness and COVID-19? Or is it just another reproduction of what Alana set out in the 19th century race science? So that's interesting, right? Like, how do we understand COVID-19 as having a relation to race without sort of falling into the trappings of race science?
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening. It's really, really problematic, because what's happening is that people have pointed out that Black and brown people, Latino people to a certain extent, indigenous people in North America are suffering disproportionately from COVID-19. And immediately you have all these people jumping up and down and saying, well, they must have some kind of gene for it, right? Yeah. And this has led to all kinds of extremely punitive ideas, not only the kind of, the herd immunity approach and the let them die approach, but also punitive approaches to which will end up curtailing people's autonomy because they're perceived to belong to at-risk groups. And what this does is completely misread the ways in which race as a socioeconomic and political project, right, has an effect on the body, right? So the relationship, the direction of this relationship is not from the body to the political, but from the political to the body. So race does take effect in the body. I mean, it's true that, for example, if diabetes is something that puts you at greater risk of COVID, there is a greater propensity to diabetes among, for example, members of the Aboriginal community over a certain age, right? But the reason why there's a greater propensity to diabetes is not because this is somehow a natural function of Aboriginal people, because Aboriginal people had no such propensity to these kinds of diseases prior to colonization, but it's as a direct consequence of colonization for all kinds of reasons, but one of which, I'll just pick one out because it's something that's not usually thought about, is the complete destruction of local food and food knowledges via the process of colonization, which has led to an alteration in the diet and also added to that a situation of living in poverty, which means, as we know, a lack of access to healthy food, right? Which then obviously has a knock-on effect when it comes to things like diabetes and heart disease. And we know this in the general population, that if you don't eat more healthily, then you're going to have a problem. But if the reason you're not eating healthily is because poverty has kept you from being able to do so, and we know that poverty disproportionately affects African-American people in the United States, Bangladeshi people in the UK, and Aboriginal people in Australia, just to take three groups, then we know that obviously these things are going to have an effect. So the problem is not that people are genetically predisposed to becoming more sick, it's that racism has made them over generations more sick, and therefore they are going to be more at risk when it comes to COVID-19. And the problem with explaining this, I mean, it's quite basic, right? It's not that difficult to explain, because there's been no effort to explain the maintenance of race as a political project, and there's been this collapsing of race into a question of genetics and biology. we jump straight to that. And that can go in various directions. And some of the most egregious directions it's going in, quite alarmingly at the moment, is like, well, there's nothing you can do about it, so be it if they die, right? And then the more liberal approach to that is, well, we have to curtail these people's freedoms because obviously they're more naturally at risk. And this idea of naturally being at risk is something that's extremely problematic because it completely obscures how it came to be that over generations people are at greater risk of particular illnesses.
Yeah. And the so-called liberal argument that we need to curtail their freedoms, of course, absolves state responsibility to a very large extent.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, and just to extend our discussion about marginality during crisis, I was also thinking about marginality as a state of crisis. One of my friends who studies at Columbia had written something where she was basically thinking about, as people who are engaged in critical theory and critical thinking, why are we surprised when we see all of this happening around us, right? And she says that perhaps the surprise that we're experiencing has to do with the everydayness of crisis catching up to us.
Absolutely.
And so it's not the case that, things have gotten bad now that COVID is here, but that things have always been bad. And there's a way in which a crisis of this scale, and perhaps a crisis that we are able to term a crisis, we are able to term an event, really puts into focus some of those marginalizations that have existed for a while. Yeah. So do you have any thoughts on that, or should I?
No, I think you're absolutely right. It just makes me think about, Patrick Wolf's formulation of colonialism being a structure, not an event. But it's much more convenient to think about things as events. So we talk about after the coronavirus, or we talk about the new normal, as though, as you're saying, this wasn't just throwing into relief situations of gross, marginality and inequity that have been pre-existing and have hence exacerbated the crisis. And I think it's very interesting to look at what form the crisis is taking in various countries, which runs along what you would expect based on what we know of the race and class politics of those particular places. So I'm not talking here about better or worse outcomes or better or worse political responses, but I'm talking about the different characterizations of them, the different character that they're taking in different places, which kind of maps onto the particular ways in which race governmentalities, racialized governmentalities take shape in those particular locations. So in France, to take one example, you have the police going into black and brown areas with truncheons and literally beating people back to the door, right? And that's obviously completely consistent with this idea that these are ghettos that need to be controlled, almost in a complete mirroring of the way France enacted its politics of colonization in Algeria and other places.
Yeah. And just to say a little bit about, what's happening where I am, of course, as soon as coronavirus broke out, there was a real demonizing of Muslims as, and it was labeled Corona Jihad, right? And of course, what we see, and there are tons of news reports about this that, any of you can Google after this, the migrant crisis, because there are a lot of migrant laborers in India who come from different parts of the country, and there's no way for them to return home. So it is very much an issue of class, caste, religion as well. And those problems have always existed. It's just, this is a dark reminder of some kind.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This next question's an interesting one. I hadn't actually thought about this before. An anonymous attendee asks, "Hi Alana, I'm thinking about the idea that decolonization is not a metaphor." So I think they're referring to the Tuck and Yang piece. And so thinking about this idea of decolonization as not a metaphor and how it might apply to anti-racism. Are you able to speak to the distinction between not being a racist and anti-racism, right? So what is the distinction between those two, if any? And is there a threshold, for the lack of a better term, for anti-racism? Yeah.
So there seems to be two questions.
Yeah.
One is about decolonization is not a metaphor, and the other one is about not racism and anti-racism. So I'm trying to think about how to connect these two things up. I mean, I think there are no good words, really, are there? I mean, because if we think about what I said earlier about the fight against anti-Semitism being used as a proxy for anti-racism, or, for example, in relation to the furor around anti-Semitism in the British Labour Party, the retaliation from those on the left of the Labour Party who were upset about anti-Semitism being called out was constantly, but Labour is the anti-racist party, right? And yes, there was a particular weaponization of anti-Semitism among certain quarters, but at the same time, also, yes, there was a massive problem of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party, because anti-Semitism exists in all institutions in one form or another. And so it's of no great surprise, just as racism exists in all institutions in one form or another. Yeah. So elsewhere, I've written about the problem of anti-racism as a badge which shields the wearer from accusation. So you can say, I'm an anti-racist, and even speak to particular histories of participation in anti-racist mobilizations, right? And that this is enough for you to be excused from any present racism. You'll need to excuse me for a second, because I just see that I'm out of battery on my computer. I need to bend down for a second.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what's going on. Oh, there I am. It just was a loose connection. Okay. So there's a problem. You know, like anything, you cannot decide that you're an anti-racist, right? I call myself an anti-racist, but I'm sure, and I know for a fact, that there have been situations in which that has been lacking, that has been insufficient, or it's been a failure. And so your anti-racism is only as good as your last action, right? And you can always fail. You can always mess up, okay? So anti-racism is a project that needs to be enacted in the everyday. It needs to be constantly reinforced, and you need to be constantly reevaluating what your thoughts are in relation to what I said before, which is that racism and race as a project is constantly changing and adapting to new processes. So what was true for today, for yesterday, may not be true for today, or may need to be rethought. And you cannot say, because when I was a student in the 1970s, I did this and I did that, and therefore you cannot accuse me. Well, you know, the conditions in which we're all acting have changed. So you can't just hark back to some glorious past. And that's kind of the problem that I have with Asad Haider's book, not to hark on about it, but he talks about the need to recover, I think he calls it an insurgent universalism, which kind of would build on the traditions of the Black Power movement and earlier the Haitian Revolution. Well, these are all fantastic and great, and of course we gain inspiration from them, but we're not living in those times anymore, A. And B, at the time there were problems with those movements, right? They weren't, we see the path through rose-colored glasses, and we fail to think about the fact that a lot of the problems that we're having today were problems that were being had then, but also that situations have changed. And for example, the whole issue of gender and sexuality, or the issues of gender and sexuality, were not as thought about. So the intersectional approach to race, class, gender, and sexuality was not as well theorized in the past as it is today. So maybe we need to reevaluate on the basis of that really important work, right? So that's one thing. Now, the other piece, and it's also problematic in Haider's book, and it's the other part of the argument that I develop in that chapter, is, and I do there cite decolonization is not a metaphor, because he completely dismisses the critique that comes from Indigenous activists of the insufficiencies of left organization, left movement organizing. He kind of, it's kind of done in an aside, so maybe it's not kind of fair to pick on him, but it's quite indicative of this failure to realize that ultimately all of these discussions and debates and actions and whatever are being had on still colonized land in North America, in Australia, in Aotearoa, etc., and in other places. And unless we put that at the heart of how we're thinking about the function of race, then I think it's insufficient. And so ultimately, when Aboriginal activists, for example, say, okay, you're an anti-racist, what they want to know is, when are you ceding power? When are you leaving, basically, right? When are you paying us reparations for land stolen and still occupied and colonized today? Right. And these are enormous questions that have a material impact in the day-to-day for people across the board. And this is the other piece which is uncomfortable for anti-racists, is that it also affects, or it also concerns, people who are victims of racism in other ways, when they are also settlers on colonized lands. It doesn't negate the fact that they face racism, but it still means that they're in relation to the fact of colonization, that they benefit from colonization despite being victims of racism, or despite being targets of racism. So all of this makes it very difficult to, to act together, because there are massive questions that need to be resolved, and that probably won't be resolved.
Yeah. Okay, so for this next bit, I just wanted to read out a question that we've had with us for a little while, and I've really been saving this towards the end of the session because it is a bit more hopeful than the stuff we've been talking about, and also to just bring in the little bit that I've read of your book. So Gloria asks in her question, racism and its insidious nature, and also how it is often treated as just a difference of opinion, right? How can this debilitating, hateful act be dealt with in ways that bring harmony, understanding, and respect among the human race? So of course, this is a very large question, and there are no easy answers to something like that. But I know in your book, you talk about something called racial literacy, right? As being in opposition to an answer to white ignorance. And I was wondering if you could speak about that notion of racial literacy, and perhaps whatever else you'd like to say in response to Gloria's question.
Yeah. Hi, Gloria. Gloria and I were speaking earlier on today. So look, I'm getting a little bit worried about racial literacy. I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, right. Because so racial literacy is not something I came up with at all. It's a concept that comes from Frances Whiddens, and another person who's written about it was Lani Guinier, sort of in the early, both of them writing in the early 2000s, and various other people have taken up the concept, but hasn't been used as much recently, I suppose. And so a number of people such as Odette Calada, who works at the University of Melbourne, who teaches a course in racial literacy, and my friend and colleague, Dr. Debbie Bargali, who works at Griffith University in Queensland, are talking about ways of doing racial literacy. And what's been happening, because we've been having these conversations, and I talk about it in my book, is that people will say to me, so how do we increase racial literacy? How do we do it better? And I'm really worried, and I know Gloria's not going to like this answer because she is a very positive and hopeful person. I'm really worried that people think it can be like the white fragility training sessions, right? And we'll do racial literacy training for the media or for educators, and that we'll be on the way to resolving the problem of racism. And that's kind of not the way it was conceived at all. So Whiddens and Guinier, particularly Whiddens, talks about racial literacy as a set of tools for, in her instance, Black families. I think she talks particularly about Black British biracial families who want to try to have the tools to understand their own experiences and to better explain to their children the racism that they face. So the way in which racial literacy is being conceived is not in order to create something for white people who are ignorant about racism. to do things better. It's actually a tool of empowerment to understand the ways in which race continues to frame the life chances of racialized people in order to equip them better to navigate through that world. So when you look at that, it kind of is turned on its head to what people imagine that it would be. And the other piece of that, which is, I suppose, is what I do more, is to think about how race is purposefully and willfully made absent from discussions in general. So racial illiteracy, it's not a question of ignorance, it's a project, it's decisive. It is, we are going to not make this about race. And you are the one who's putting a thorn in my side by making it about race. How dare you, right? And my point is, and let's look at academia for a start. We're so bad at understanding the history and politics and sociology of race. And that there's a reason for that, because it allows the maintenance of white supremacism within our institutions. And what I want to do, what I mean by racial literacy, is exposing that and showing how it works in order to show the workings of race. At the moment, we're all doing a lot of homeschooling with the children. And when the children do maths, it says, show how you worked it out. Show it, right? Don't just give me the answer, show how you worked it out, right? So this is kind of what I mean by racial literacy. Show me how a situation is racial, right? Like the ABCs of that. So when I talked about the toolbox, open the toolbox, take out all the tools and tell me how they all work, right? But not in order for you to be, not you, of course, but for one, let's say for a white journalist to come along and do a training course in racial literacy in the same way that they do racism awareness and cultural safety and all that blah, blah, blah that they do, right? And then to go back to their position of power and privilege and say, I've checked that box, right? And continue on as they left off, right? That's not what I'm looking for. And I'm beginning to be very scared that that's where how I'm being positioned. When people hear racial literacy, they think, oh, Alana Lentin, she's going to be rolling out training courses. And that scares me to death. And so actually, I was thinking about this today. I think I'm actually going to write a paper about this, just so that, nobody can accuse me of something that I didn't want to set out to do. Yeah. So that's not really an answer to Gloria. I'm really sorry. But I think she knows me well enough by now to know that that's kind of the answer she was going to get.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, I think those are some really important points. And what you said about what racial literacy is, I mean, if race and racism and colonialism are processes and not events, then surely the solution, and I mean this very tenuously when I say solution, must also be a process and not an event. And I mean, what you were saying reminded me of, for example, consciousness raising, right, in the feminist waves, for example. And sure, they might have started as sessions or workshops or whatever, but I think that's over time become a part of the feminist movement. And it's something that the feminist movement, I mean, again, not homogenous, but has had to return to in order to, for example, see its blind spots with regard to race, for example. And similarly with, Paulo Freire, who's the critical pedagogue, who's written Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he talks about that the purpose of education is, again, to raise consciousness. And that is not about enrolling in a program or getting a degree, but rather what does it mean to then be a student of that politics in some sense over the course of your life. So that's what you said, and that's what it reminded me of. But I just wanted to, we don't have a lot of time, but I think I wanted to end on a question that I think could be important. You mentioned this in your introduction, where you talk about anger and the role of anger. And I think anger certainly gets quite a bad name in certain forms of politics. And I mean, it has also a relationship with race, right? I mean, the trope of the angry black woman or the violent black man or the savage indigenous folk, so are there perhaps productive ways in which we can think about anger, and how do you think about anger, is something I wanted to ask you.
I mean, obviously, if we're not angry about all of this, then, as the saying goes, we're not paying attention. And so I think that anger is absolutely necessary as a trigger for action. You can't read this stuff or look at what's happening in the world impassively, as if, you know, it's just one of those things. And I think that when racism is engaged in as a matter of debate or just another talking point or subject, you know, as I say, you know, let's just have a discussion about eugenics, you know, why not? You know, this is freedom of speech. Let me just have a discussion about eugenics impassively, because, you know, why not? We're rational, enlightened intellectuals. That in itself should make us extremely angry. And the response, the anger that I have in response to that is not disproportionate. I mean, that's the way it's characterized, right? So why are you so angry? You're being irrational. You're being hysterical. These are actually words that are quite often leveled at me. And I'm like, no, this is actually me being calm. You know? So the point is that I think that we can't get angry enough. And I think it's a misnomer to think that anger is detached from rationality, right? Because, as I say, if we take a step back and actually look at what is happening in the world, the only rational response is anger. So I find it interesting. I'm talking about political anger, right? I'm not talking about shouting at people, and it's a different story. Political anger is a mobilizing force in a way to frame why we should care, okay? And I don't understand why, let me put this another way. I think there's a lot of investment in caricaturizing anger as irrational and disproportionate and hysterical, and those on the other side as rational and calm and having the right approach to things. Actually, if we think of what's being done in the name of rationality and calmness, etc., it's literally causing people's deaths. I mean, literally causing people's deaths, because economic rationality, for example, is being used to argue for herd immunity in the present crisis, but this is only just one example. You know, if we think about debates around policing and criminality in relation to race, these are all supposed to be coming from a common sense approach. So it's only common sense to preemptively, you know, put people's DNA in files because they come from a neighborhood where many people have gone to prison. Therefore, at the age of 4, it's absolutely fine to put their DNA on file because this, you know, in the future, at least we'll have been prepared, right? Which is literally the policy in US policing and also to a certain extent in other places. That's supposed to be rational, right? That to me is the world turned on its head, and therefore being angry about that exposes it, and actually exposes the utter perversity of the rational and calm so-called approach.
I think that's the perfect note to end on, and it's all we have time for today. But thank you so much, Alana, and
thanks a lot
to everybody who's joined us, was so engaged and participated even just through their presence. So thank you, everyone. And if you have any feedback on this session or any of our other sessions, which you can watch on Belongg's YouTube channel, please feel free to write to me at Manjari, MANJARI, @Belongg with 2 Gs .net. I hope you remember that. I'm not sure you will. But thank you anyway. And thank you, Alana. It was lovely speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for organizing. Thank you.
Of course. Good night, everyone. I mean, wherever you are, really. Have a good one.
Bye.